The road outside the small farming village was quiet that morning. Heat already pressed low across the ground, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust. On a worn patch of earth beside the roadside, a thin, brown dog sat as if rooted in place. His ribs rose sharply under his coat, each breath shallow but steady. His eyes followed the slow movement of an ox cart passing in the distance, but the rest of his body did not shift. Ranger Mateo was on his morning patrol, the hum of his motorbike breaking the stillness. He slowed as he approached, instinct drawing his gaze to the shape in the dirt. The dog was alone, no collar, no sign of an owner nearby. There was no shade to shield him, yet he stayed exactly where he was, tail flat against the ground, paws pressed into the dust. Mateo eased the bike to a stop a few meters away. The engine ticked as it cooled in the morning air. He stepped down, keeping his movements slow. The dog's ears twitched at the sound, but he did not stand. There was no growl, no bark, only a blink that came slowly, as though his energy was measured in careful, deliberate pieces. The road ran straight through fields of millet and low scrub, with no houses in immediate sight. A shallow ditch ran alongside it, lined with weeds and scattered plastic. Nothing in the dog's surroundings explained why he was here. Mateo's work had taught him to recognize certain patterns. Injured animals often try to hide, while strays will wander in search of food. This one did neither. He crouched slightly, studying the animal from where he stood. The dog's fur was coarse, dusty, with a faint scar tracing along the ribs on his right side. One front paw rested at an odd angle, but not in a way that seemed immediately painful. His eyes, though dulled with fatigue, remained fixed on the same point across the road. A pair of young boys passed carrying buckets toward the village well. They glanced at the dog but didn't stop. One muttered to the other, and they walked on. It was clear the animal had been here long enough to become part of the roadside landscape, seen but not approached. Mateo took a slow step forward. The dog's head turned toward him, but the body stayed planted. There was a quiet stillness about him, not the kind that comes from rest, but the heavy, unmoving stillness of waiting. "It's all right," Mateo said softly, his voice low enough to carry no threat. The only response was a slight lift of the dog's ears before they fell again. His gaze shifted back toward the open stretch of dirt ahead of him. A breeze lifted, carrying grit that swirled against Mateo's boots. Somewhere in the fields, a bird called once and fell silent. The sun was climbing quickly, and in another hour this bare strip of road would hold the day's full heat. Without water, the dog would weaken fast. Without shade, the risk of heat stroke was certain. If the animal did not move, he would not survive much longer. That fact sat plainly between them in the still air. Mateo remained where he was, watching the way the dog's chest rose and fell. He would not rush forward. Sudden movements could drive the animal into the road, and a sprint in this condition could be the end. The moment stretched, unchanging. The dog seated in his place, Mateo standing a short distance away. The road running on into the shimmering light. Something bound the animal to this patch of ground. Whatever it was strong enough to hold him there against hunger, thirst, and heat. Mateo shifted his weight and took another step closer. The dog's head turned just enough for one ear to catch his voice, but the rest of him remained pressed to the ground. His front paws lay half buried in the loose dust, toes curled inward as if gripping the soil itself. The stillness was not born of calm. It was the kind that holds an animal in place even when every instinct should tell it to flee. The air trembled with heat, carrying the faint metallic scent of the dry road. Flies circled lazily, landing along the dog's flank where an old scar marked the rib cage in a pale, hairless line. The wound was long healed, but its presence hinted at a past of hardship. Injury, perhaps a fight, perhaps something worse. The skin twitched under each landing insect, but still he did not rise. "Come on, boy," Mateo said softly, the words barely louder than a breath. The dog lowered his head, chin nearly touching the ground. It was not aggression, not even fear. It was refusal. Mateo knew the dangers well. In this stretch of road, vehicles passed infrequently, but when they did, they moved quickly. At night, the temperature would drop sharply. Without shelter or the ability to move freely, the dog would be vulnerable not just to the cold, but to the jackals that sometimes came close to the village edge. If he remained here, it was only a matter of time before something took him. A light wind pressed at Mateo's shirt, carrying the smell of millet stalks from the fields. The dog's ears flicked again, this time toward a sound somewhere in the distance, too faint for Mateo to catch. His eyes tracked something unseen, then returned to that same fixed point on the road ahead. Mateo crouched, keeping a steady distance. The dog's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling in measured effort. His coat was dry, the dust clinging where fur had thinned. He shifted one hind leg slightly, enough to reveal a streak of raw skin on the inside of the thigh. It looked recent. Mateo suspected the animal had been here for days, surviving on nothing more than the occasional kindness of passers-by, or perhaps on nothing at all. From the far end of the road, an elderly farmer came walking, carrying a woven sack over one shoulder. He slowed when he saw Mateo, his eyes moving to the dog. Without speaking, he gestured toward the animal, then shook his head as if to say, "He's been here a while." The man continued on, his sandals scuffing the ground. Mateo took that as confirmation. This was no passing stray simply pausing for rest. This was an animal bound to a location by something stronger than hunger or thirst. The ranger reached into the side pouch of his motorbike for a small tin canteen. He poured a thin stream of water into a shallow plastic lid, then set it on the ground within reach. The dog's nostrils flared. His eyes shifted toward the lid, but he did not move. Only after a long pause did his tongue flick out, slow and tentative. He leaned forward just enough to lap twice, then withdrew, his chin returning to the dirt. Mateo noted the hesitation, not weakness alone, but a clear choice. Something here outweighed his need to drink. The heat pressed closer, a dense weight on skin and fur alike. Mateo could see a faint tremor in the dog's forelimbs, the kind that comes when muscles begin to give way under long strain. If those legs failed, he would not be able to rise at all. If that happened here, under the afternoon sun, the end would be quick. Mateo stayed still, letting the silence hold between them. Patience, he knew, was its own kind of movement, sometimes the only way to close the distance between fear and trust. Another small gust stirred the dust, coating the water in a thin film of grit. The dog ignored it. His gaze stayed locked ahead, his body anchored to the same spot as though the earth itself had claimed him. What bound him here was not yet clear, but Mateo understood one thing with certainty. If he did not leave this place soon, he would not live to see another dawn. Mateo lowered himself to one knee, careful not to startle the dog. The air was still, carrying the faint sweetness of dry grass and the sharper tang of dust. From this closer view, he could see more clearly what lay before the animal. A shallow depression in the earth, the size and shape of a curled body. The soil there was pressed flat, its edges uneven, as if something had shifted restlessly in place over many hours. Beside the hollow, a scatter of brittle grass lay crushed and faded. It had been broken not by wind or passing feet, but by the repeated weight of something lying here. The marks were recent enough to be visible, but not fresh. Whatever had been here last had left days ago, or perhaps not left at all. The dog's gaze flicked toward the hollow again, then back to the road. A low whine escaped him, thin and wavering before he closed his mouth and went still once more. Mateo followed his line of sight, searching for movement, but the road remained empty. A small tin bowl rested a short distance from the hollow, turned slightly on its side. The rim was scratched and the inside was bone dry. A stone weighted the edge, keeping it from rolling away in the wind. Matteo reached for it, feeling the roughness of its surface, the faint grit inside. This had been placed here with purpose, left by someone who had not returned. The dog's body tensed as Matteo shifted the bowl, not in fear, but in a subtle awareness. Eyes following the movement, ears tilting forward. His tail remained still against the ground. Matteo placed the bowl back where it had been. He had seen this before in other places. A spot claimed by an animal because it held the scent, the memory of another. Sometimes it was a resting place. Sometimes it was where something had ended. Whatever the reason, this dog was guarding it. The sun was higher now, its heat spreading over the road in slow waves. The dog's breathing had grown heavier, each inhale pulling his thin sides inward. Flies gathered at the corners of his eyes, and he blinked them away without moving his head. Matteo could see the strain in his posture. Hunger could be endured for days, but without enough water in this heat, the risk of collapse was close. If he remained here much longer, the damage would be permanent. Heat exhaustion could come quickly now, and with it, confusion, weakness, and death. Yet the animal's focus never wavered from the patch of ground. Matteo shifted slightly, resting one hand on the dirt. It was warm and dry, the kind of soil that holds the day's heat long after sunset. He imagined it beneath a smaller, lighter body, paws curled close, breath shallow, waiting for someone who never came. The dog turned his head toward Matteo for the first time, his eyes catching the light. They held no challenge, no threat, only a watchfulness that seemed older than his years. Then, as if remembering his post, he looked back to the hollow. "It's all right," Matteo murmured, though the dog gave no sign of hearing. In the distance, a motorbike passed on the far side of the fields, the sound fading quickly. The world here felt contained within the boundaries of this small circle of earth, the dog at its center, unwilling to yield. Matteo stayed a moment longer, letting the silence settle. He understood now that this was no random place on the roadside. It was the reason for the animal's refusal. The anchor keeping him here despite hunger, thirst, and the pull of survival itself. Whatever had happened on this patch of ground, it was enough to hold him in place until his body could no longer bear it. Matteo stayed crouched near the hollow, his hand resting lightly on the dry soil. The sound of footsteps on gravel drew his attention. A woman in a faded blue headscarf had stopped a short distance away, a bundle of laundry balanced against her hip. She stood watching, her eyes shifting between Matteo and the dog. After a moment, she stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate. She spoke quietly, telling him she had passed this way each morning for the past 3 days. The dog, she said, had not moved from this place, not even when the rain came 2 nights ago. He had been here through the downpour, sitting as he was now, water pooling around his paws. No one had claimed him. The villagers thought perhaps he had belonged to a traveler, someone who had stopped to rest and never returned. Her voice held no drama, only the even tone of someone sharing what they had seen. When she shifted the weight of the laundry, the dog's ears turned toward the sound, but he did not rise. She nodded toward the hollow, then toward the fields, as though to say that whatever bound him here was not far from where they stood. When she left, Matteo turned his focus to the ground beyond the depression. The soil was loose here, dry at the surface but darker where the last rain had soaked in. Years of tracking in the field had trained his eyes to see what others missed, the faint lines of movement pressed into the earth. Paw prints, faint but clear enough in shape, led away from the hollow toward a strip of thicket at the far edge of the road. Most of the impressions were deep and firm, likely made by the dog now before him. But alongside them, weaving in and out, was another set. Lighter, smaller. The stride was shorter, uneven in places as though the animal had moved with less strength. Matteo followed the line of tracks to where they disappeared into the brush. The road behind him was silent. The dog lifted his head slightly, watching Mateo's movements with the same fixed gaze he had used for the empty horizon. The thicket was dense in parts, its outer edges catching the light where the leaves had dried and curled. Between the stems, the ground was shaded, the soil damp from the last rainfall. Mateo crouched low, searching the narrow trail that cut between the plants. The prints continued here, the smaller set sometimes overstepping the larger, as if the two animals had walked closely together. He could see where the earth had been disturbed in a shallow scrape, perhaps from a paw pushing aside leaves. Beyond that, the lighter prints ended abruptly, while the deeper ones returned to the road. It was as though one had gone on, and the other had not. Mateo stayed still for a long moment, letting the quiet of the thicket settle around him. No movement, no sound of breathing, no shifting in the brush, only the distant hum of insects in the fields. He stood and traced the path back toward the dog. The animal had not moved, but his eyes followed Mateo's return. The gaze was not one of expectation, but of confirmation, watching to see what he might have learned. If those smaller prints belonged to a pup, the risk was grave. A young dog, alone in this terrain, would have a little chance of surviving without shelter or regular food. If injured, the danger was greater still. The heat would take a toll on a small body far faster than on an adult. Mateo's mind turned over the possibilities. The older dog's refusal to leave the hollow made sense if he was guarding the last place he had seen the younger one. That would explain the 3 days of waiting, the absence of movement, the vigilance even in exhaustion. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of damp soil from the thicket. The dog's nose lifted slightly, then returned to its still position. Mateo could feel the press of time in that moment. Whatever had happened to the one who left those smaller prints, it had happened close by, and not long ago. He looked once more toward the brush, the narrow path disappearing into its shadow. If there was something to be found there, it would not wait forever. And if the dog was right to guard this place, then what lay beyond those leaves might explain everything. The woman returned as Mateo stepped toward the edge of the thicket. She had left her laundry in the village and come back, curiosity and concern drawing her. Without a word, she joined him, her hands brushing the leaves aside as they searched for the start of a path. The air was still here, heavy with the scent of damp soil and leaf mold. They moved carefully, the dry litter beneath their feet crackling faintly. The path narrowed almost immediately, winding between thin branches that snagged at their sleeves. The deeper they went, the cooler the air became, the sunlight breaking into fragments across the ground. Each step carried them further from the open road, the sounds of the village fading until only the slow hum of insects remained. 10 meters in, the trail dipped slightly. A twisted branch jutted low over the path, forcing them to duck. Beyond it, in the dim patch of shade, Mateo saw the outline before he recognized what it was, a small, still shape lying close to the base of the branch. He knelt, brushing aside a layer of dust from the fur. The body was light beneath his hand, no more than a year old by the size of the limbs. The coat was dulled by dirt, the paws curled inward. There was no sign of struggle, no obvious wound, only the stillness of something long past moving. The woman stayed a few steps back, her face turned slightly away. Mateo studied the ground around the body. The soil here was uneven, disturbed in shallow arcs as though something had scraped at it repeatedly. The marks were small at first, then deeper, pulling the earth toward the form before him. He recognized the pattern. Paws had worked here, over and over, clearing leaves, shifting soil, trying to reach what was already beyond help. The spacing of the marks, their depth and direction, matched the older dog's prints exactly. Mateo's breath left him in a slow exhale. The truth was simple, unembellished. The dog on the roadside had been here before, had found the younger one lifeless, and had done what little could be done, covering, uncovering, sitting close until the stillness would not change. And when there was nothing left to do, he had gone back to the road, guarding the nearest point between himself and this place. The air was cooler here, but the weight of the moment pressed heavier than the heat outside. The woman shifted her stance, the dry leaves beneath her feet whispering softly. "We should go," she said gently, her voice low. Matteo nodded. He brushed the dust from his palms and rose. There was nothing more to find here. No tracks beyond this point, no signs of life. The smaller prints ended at the hollow where the body lay. As they stepped back onto the path, Matteo glanced once more toward the twisted branch. The shape beneath it seemed even smaller now. The dust beginning to settle again over fur. Soon it would be hidden from sight entirely, known only to the one who waited by the road. When they emerged into the open air, the older dog was still there, exactly as they had left him. His eyes shifted to Matteo instantly, not with relief, but with quiet awareness. Matteo understood the depth of that gaze. It was not the look of an animal waiting for help, but of one holding a vigil he could not abandon. If the dog continued this watch, his own body would fail in time. Without food or shelter, the weight of sun and cold would claim him as surely as it had the younger one. That truth settled in Matteo's chest, the same way the dust had settled in the shaded hollow behind them. The woman turned toward the village, her steps slow. Matteo stayed a moment longer, the stillness of the road mirroring the stillness in the thicket. The two places were bound together, and between them stood a single dog, unmoving. When Matteo stepped back onto the roadside, the brown dog was exactly where he had been before. His head was lifted slightly, ears drawn forward, gaze locked on the line of trees and undergrowth where the narrow path began. Dust clung to the fur along his shoulders, and his tail lay flat against the ground, unmoving. Matteo lowered himself slowly to one knee, careful not to startle him. The dog's eyes shifted to meet his for a brief moment, then returned to the thicket as though pulled by an unseen tether. He rose to his feet once, stepping toward Matteo as if weighing whether to bridge the space between them, then eased back down onto his side, angling his body toward the hidden hollow in the woods. The woman from the village had followed at a distance. Now she stood by the road's edge, her hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the scene. A few other villagers had gathered, their expressions quiet, their voices absent. No one came closer. The weight of the moment seemed to hold them where they stood. The dog's breathing was slow but shallow, ribs lifting in a narrow rhythm. His front paws were stretched forward, the nails worn and dulled. When the wind shifted, the faint scent of earth and dried leaves carried from the thicket, and the dog's nostrils flared. He gave a low sound, half whine, half exhale, then stilled again. Matteo watched the angle of the dog's body, the fixed position of his head. It was not random. The line between this roadside hollow and the shaded place under the twisted branch was straight, unbroken. The older dog's vigil was deliberate. "He's waiting," Matteo murmured, not to anyone in particular. The woman's brow furrowed. 3 days, she said quietly. No food, only rainwater. The risks were immediate and plain. Without food, the dog's strength would fail within days. Without clean water, the heat would take him sooner. Yet each moment he remained here, the chance of him leaving on his own diminished. Instinct might have drawn him to follow his companion into the brush at the start, but something stronger than instinct now kept him here. Matteo shifted his weight, reaching slowly into his satchel. He withdrew a small container, the last of the provisions he carried, dried meat and a collapsible bowl. The dog's head turned toward the faint sound of the packet opening, but his paws did not move. The watch was not abandoned, not even for hunger. He placed the bowl on the ground a meter away, filling it with water from his canteen. A dark line spread through the dust beneath it. The scent reached the dog's nose, and for a moment his ears twitched back, his focus breaking. Then, with the smallest movement, he rose. Each step was slow, the pads of his paws making no sound against the packed earth. He lowered his head, drinking only briefly before stopping, the water still rippling in the bowl. Mateo waited. The dog's gaze had already returned to the thicket, his body easing back to the same position, paws stretched forward toward the unseen. It was clear. He had not come to this place to survive. He had come to remain. The villagers said nothing. Their stillness matched his. Mateo knew that without intervention, this watch would end in silence, as the younger dogs had. The choice was not whether to help, but how to do so without breaking the bond the animal had anchored himself to. A cloud passed over the sun, cooling the road. The shadows lengthened toward the trees, pulling the afternoon forward. The older dog lay unmoving, eyes fixed on the place where the path disappeared from view. The wind shifted again, bending the dry grass in a slow ripple toward the thicket. Somewhere within, leaves moved against each other in a faint, brittle sound. The dog's ears lifted once, then settled back. The light thinned, and the air carried the scent of evening. Mateo stood beside him, the weight of the decision still ahead. The dog did not look away. Mateo returned to his bicycle, the air still warm from the fading afternoon. From the small carrier, he took a folded wool blanket, worn at the edges but clean. Carrying it back to the roadside, he approached the brown dog with the same slow steps he had used all day. Each one measured, each one allowing the animal to see and choose not to move away. The dog's eyes followed the blanket, then lifted briefly to Mateo's face before returning to the dark line of the thicket. The villagers kept their distance, their silhouettes still against the low sun. The road was quiet, only the faint rustle of leaves in the warm breeze carrying across it. Mateo knelt, lowering the blanket into the dust, letting it rest there a moment so that its scent mingled with the air. The dog's body tensed at first, a subtle tightening in the shoulders, but there was no step backward. Mateo eased the fabric upward, folding it gently around the dog's sides. The animal did not resist. His breathing stayed steady, shallow but even, and only when Mateo's arms came beneath him did the dog shift his weight slightly, as if adjusting to keep one line of sight toward the thicket. The lift was slow, deliberate, Mateo rising in one unbroken motion. The dog's head turned, his eyes holding on to the place where the path began. The muscles in his neck tightening as the undergrowth slipped from view. The walk to the shelter was short, yet each step carried a change. The air thickened with the scent of cooking fires from the village, and the hard edges of the road gave way to the packed earth near the shelter's entrance. A small group waited there, men and women who had seen the dog over the past days, now standing in quiet expectation. One of them, a younger man, stepped forward to clear a space inside, laying an old mat across the floor. Mateo set the dog down with the same care as before, the blanket still around him. The animal shifted his front paws onto the mat but kept his hind legs braced, his head turned toward the open doorway. A low bowl of water was placed just within reach, its surface trembling slightly as it settled. The dog drank, the sound quiet but steady. His ears, though, did not turn toward the bowl. They remained angled toward the road beyond the shelter, as if the thicket's shape could still be traced in memory alone. Someone brought a small piece of soft bread, breaking it into smaller portions. The dog sniffed, took a few bites, and then stopped. His gaze drifted again to the light outside, where the day was beginning to cool. The food, like the water, was accepted without urgency, as though his mind remained elsewhere. Mateo watched him closely, noting the slight tremor in the dog's hind legs when he shifted position. His strength was uneven. Days without proper food had taken their toll, and the strain of the vigil had kept his body taut for too long. Here, at least, the risk of collapse was eased. The shade offered relief from the sun, the water kept his throat from drying, but the deeper pull, the one that had held him to the roadside, was not something that shelter could quiet. The villagers spoke little. Their presence was steady but unintrusive, The space around the dog kept open. The mat was close to the door, allowing a clear view of the road. Mateo had placed it that way intentionally. For now, the dog had left the place where he had been found, but to turn him entirely from it would be too much. Outside, the evening light softened across the packed earth, carrying the first hints of cooler night air. The road beyond was empty, its edges blurring into the distance. Inside the shelter, the dog lay with his head on his paws, eyes half closed but still turned toward the open doorway. He had left his post, but not the memory of it. The days settled into a quiet rhythm. The dog remained close to the shelter, choosing the strip of shade beneath the eaves where the ground was cool and undisturbed. From there he could see the line of the road and the faint bend where it disappeared into the trees. His body rested more fully now, the tension in his shoulders easing with each passing day, but his gaze still carried the same fixed direction. Morning light would find him lying with his paws stretched forward, head low but ears angled toward the wind. When the breeze shifted, carrying scents from the thicket's direction, dry leaves, faint animal musk, the trace of soil turned by recent rain, his head would lift, eyes scanning the horizon as if measuring the distance. It was the same gesture he had made at the roadside, one Mateo had seen enough times to know it was not idle. The dog was listening for something that no one else could hear. Mateo visited often, moving without hurry. He would crouch near the eaves, laying down a fresh bowl of water or a small portion of softened food. The dog accepted both without urgency, eating and drinking slowly before returning his attention outward. "Still watching," Mateo would murmur, not as an attempt to call the animal back, but as a quiet recognition of the truth. The villagers had grown used to his presence. Children passed at a distance, their voices lowered, as if the place where he lay had its own quiet rule. In the afternoons, when the light fell soft across the road, some would pause to glance in his direction. They understood what Mateo had told them in the first days, that the dog's vigil had cost him strength and that it would take time for his body to recover. But the risk had not fully passed. Without care, without the shelter's protection, he could slip back toward the same fate as the one he had watched over. A few times, Mateo saw the dog rise and take several steps toward the open road. His pace was slow, not the quick, urgent movement of an animal chasing a sound, but something more deliberate. He would stop just short of the road's center, nose lifted, breathing in whatever traces the breeze carried. Then he would return to the eaves, lowering himself onto the same patch of ground. These short excursions seemed less about leaving than about making sure the way back was still there. The hollow in the earth where the younger dog had lain was now nearly gone. Wind had carried dust across it. Rain had softened the edges. Even standing there, it would be hard for a passerby to know what had been. But the shape of it remained in the dog's body. The angle of his head when he looked toward that bend. The stillness that overtook him when the air shifted. That kind of mark did not fade with the weather. By the fifth day, his coat had begun to lose its brittle texture. Small signs of recovery showed in the way he stretched in the mornings, or how his tail moved slightly when Mateo approached. But these changes were subtle, and Mateo did not press for more. The shelter's role was to give him space to stay alive, not to erase the memory that kept him looking toward the horizon. One evening, as the sun lowered beyond the hills, the dog rose from his place beneath the eaves. He stood facing the road, the sky behind him streaked with pale gold. The breeze moved through the trees along the bend, carrying with it a whisper of leaves and dust. The dog stayed there until the light began to fade, his silhouette still and steady against the shifting air. He was safe now, but part of him remained on that patch of ground. And as long as the road lay open before him, that part would not be left behind.